people who went no contact with their parents, what was the final straw that made you realize there was no going back?
I was 28 years old when I finally understood that I had the right to my own life. That sounds like a cliche, the right to my own life. But if you grew up in a family where every breath you took was subject to evaluation, commentary, or judgment, those words carry an entirely different weight. My mother always said she just wanted what was best for me. My father nodded and stayed silent. Together, they formed a perfect machine of control. One applied pressure with her voice, the other with his quiet compliance. I grew up as a girl who couldn't say no, even to her own reflection in the mirror. When I met Andrew, it felt like for the first time in my entire life, I was breathing with my whole chest. He was calm, kind, a little awkward, with the best eyes I had ever seen. He didn't try to fix me. He just loved me as I was. We dated for 3 years, and the entire time my mother consistently found flaws in him. He was not ambitious enough. He was from the wrong kind of family. He chewed strangely. Every visit turned into an interrogation, every conversation into a trial. Andrew endured it. I endured it. We both told ourselves it was just a difficult transition period. When he proposed, in the morning, in the kitchen, coffee in hand, and a ring in the pocket of his bathrobe, I cried so hard with happiness that I even startled the cat. It was the best day of my adult life. But by the following evening, I was sitting across from my mother, listening to a monologue about how you can't marry a man who doesn't own property, how I'm ruining my future, how she devoted her entire life to me, and this is how I thank her. My father nodded and stayed silent. We decided on a small wedding. 20 people, a little restaurant outside the city, no unnecessary expenses. My mother immediately declared that this simply won't do, that the neighbors will judge, and that she would organize everything properly herself. We said no. That's when the calls started. Every day. Multiple times. My mother called my friends and told them that Andrew was manipulating me and isolating me from my family. She reached out to his mother and informed her that her son was holding me hostage. She wrote my aunt a long letter describing Andrew as someone with psychological issues. But that wasn't the final straw. The final straw came 2 weeks before the wedding when I drove to my parents' house to pick up an old dress I had stored in their closet. My mother met me at the door and silently handed me an envelope. Inside was an official statement. 3 pages, printed and signed by both of my parents, demanding that we postpone the wedding, undergo family therapy together with the groom's parents, and sign some absurd agreement stating that Andrew would not have the right to interfere with my relationship with my family. It was a legally meaningless document, but the sheer fact of its existence paralyzed me for a few seconds. They were sitting at the table, both of them with serious faces, waiting for me to sign. I placed the envelope back on the table, I picked up my dress, I walked out, and I never went back. The wedding happened without them. It was the best decision of my life, and the most painful one at the same time. I grieved for the parents I never really had, for the version of family that only existed in my childhood dreams. 4 years have passed. Andrew and I are happy. I no longer receive envelopes.
There are things you remember not because they were vivid or beautiful, but because they quietly changed something in you forever. The way a foundation shifts beneath a house that no one notices until the walls begin to crack. For me, that moment was a phone call at 3 in the morning. Not the call itself, but what came after it. I was born and raised in a small town in rural Ohio. My father drank, not catastrophically, but steadily, like a daily job. My mother compensated for his absence by replacing love with control, my schedule, my grades, my friends, my thoughts. She knew better than I did who I was supposed to be. I left for college in Columbus at 18 and understood for the first time in my life that there was a world where people lived without a constant undercurrent of guilt. That discovery changed me more than any book or lecture ever had. Years passed. I graduated, found a job, rented my own apartment across town. I called home once a week. With the feeling that every call cost me some piece of myself, my mother complained. My father stayed quiet. Sometimes they switched roles, but the general message never changed. I was a bad son. I'd forgotten about my family. I was living only for myself while they grew old alone. I was 26. I felt like 50. Then Marcus came into my life. We met at work, became close friends over a few months, and gradually realized that our friendship had grown into something more. I hadn't planned to announce anything to anyone. I was simply living my life, quietly and peacefully. But someone from my hometown spotted us together and told someone, who told someone else, and eventually it reached my mother. She called at 3 in the morning. I got out of bed, stepped into the hallway. I didn't want to wake Marcus and sat down on the floor in the dark, pressing the phone to my ear. For the next 40 minutes she talked. She screamed. She cried. She threatened. She said I had brought shame to the family, that your father won't survive this, that she could no longer consider me her son. She used words I don't want to repeat here. Then my father took the phone. He didn't scream, which was almost worse, and said quietly and calmly that if I didn't fix myself, I had no reason to come home. I sat on the floor in the dark hallway and thought, this is it. This is the end. But it didn't feel like a catastrophe. It felt like a strange, unexpected clarity. As if the fog that had hung over my entire conscious life had suddenly lifted. I'd no more illusions. No more hope that things would somehow change or that they would come to understand. They had already said everything. They had put a period at the end of the sentence themselves. They just didn't know it yet. I didn't call back the next day. I didn't call back the next week. A month later, my mother sent a short text. When are you planning to call? I read it, put my phone down, and went to make coffee. Marcus was sitting in the kitchen with a book, and sunlight was falling across the table in clean, even lines, and the cat was purring on the windowsill, and all of it felt so alive and real, and mine that I felt my breath catch in my throat from gratitude, not from pain. I was finally living my own life. I was no longer proving anything to anyone or explaining myself to anyone.
I'm 41 years old, and this is the first time I have said this out loud. Not in a journal, not silently in my head before falling asleep, but in real words that someone might actually read. That alone means something. I couldn't talk about my childhood for years, simply because I didn't have the language for it. When you grow up in an environment where your pain is systematically denied, you eventually begin to deny it yourself. It's a defense mechanism. It's what helps you survive. But then you turn 40 and you realize that surviving is not the same thing as living. My mother was a woman of a very particular type, one that society tends to call selfless. She truly did sacrifice a great deal: her career, her social life, her own desires. But no one ever asked us, her children, what price we paid for those sacrifices. We owed her, constantly, inescapably. Every home-cooked meal carried a debt inside it. Every purchased item became a future argument. I do everything for you. That wasn't love. That was a contract whose terms changed depending on her mood. My father died when I was 12. After that, my mother became our entire universe, mine and my younger sister's. And she was well aware of that monopoly. She never hit us. She did something subtler and harder to name. She convinced us that we were not good enough, while also making sure we understood how lucky we were to have a mother who loved us anyway. Gaslighting. I learned that word at 35, and it was one of the most important words of my adult life. The final moment came unexpectedly. I had long been living on my own, had built my own family, had a 9-year-old daughter. My relationship with my mother had settled into something functional. in the sense that I had learned to keep distance and not give her too much access to my inner life. But one afternoon, while she was visiting us for a week, I walked into my daughter's room and saw a scene that still appears in my dreams. My mother was sitting beside 9-year-old Sophie, quietly and methodically explaining to her that Daddy was also a difficult child, that he never appreciated what was done for him, and that Sophie should be careful not to end up the same way. The child was listening with wide eyes, not fully understanding what was happening. I asked my mother to leave the room, politely but firmly. She took offense and retreated to the guest room. That evening there was a full scene, tears, accusations. "I come to visit and you throw me out." The next morning I drove her to the Greyhound station and told her we needed a break. That break has now lasted 3 years. I don't regret it. I regret that I didn't do it sooner. My daughter is growing up in a home where no one tells her she is not good enough. That is the most important thing I have ever done for her.
My grandmother left behind a small lake house in upstate New York. 3 rooms, a porch facing the water, and an old wood-burning stove that needed feeding every morning in winter. Nothing of great monetary value, but nothing burdened with debt either. Just a house where my happiest childhood memories lived. Those summer weeks when I was allowed to stay with Grandma Ruth and could finally breathe. When she passed, I assumed the inheritance would be a simple formality. I didn't think it would become an ending. My parents divorced when I was 7. My mother got custody of me. My father disappeared, first for a few months, then for a few years. He came back when I was 15, with a new wife and an attempt to build a relationship from scratch. I gave him a chance. In fact, I kept giving him chances all the way to 32, regularly and patiently, like someone who walks up to a locked door and knocks, every time hoping that this time it will open. My mother, for her part, never forgave him, and never forgave me for trying to maintain a relationship with him. So I ended up caught between 2 people who each considered me their ally in an endless Cold War. They hadn't spoken directly to each other in 25 years, but they spoke about each other constantly. To me. I became a living mailbox for other people's hatred. Every visit to my mother meant 2 hours of complaints about my father. Every call from my father meant half an hour of accusations against my mother. I learned to nod and not respond. I learned to make myself invisible. When the inheritance question arose, both of them suddenly remembered I existed, not as a person, but as a tool. My mother demanded that I transfer the property to her name legally because she spent her entire childhood in that house and has more of a claim to it. My father called to insist that your mother just wants the money and she's manipulating you, and that I have to hold my ground. Neither of them cared about the house itself. What they needed was a victory over each other, and I was supposed to be the battlefield. I drove to that lake house alone, without either of them. I spent the weekend there. I walked through the rooms, touched the walls, sat on the porch in the morning light and cried. Not from grief, but from an understanding that finally arrived with its full weight. These people will never change. They will never truly see me. They only see each other, and the hatred that has, over the years, become more important to them than any living person nearby. I sold the house. I put the money into savings and took a long trip. My first real vacation, without calls, without explanations, without guilt. I sent both parents one message. I need time for myself. Please don't call. 2 years have passed. Neither of them has asked how I am. They both still write, but only to complain about each other. I no longer respond. I am no longer anyone's mailbox. I was always told I was too sensitive. From childhood, my mother first, then teachers, then a first boyfriend, then my mother again. You take everything too personally. You're easy to hurt. Sometimes you just have to let things roll off you. I heard it so often and for so long that I eventually believed it. Maybe I really was too sensitive. Maybe something really was wrong with me. The therapist I finally went to see at 29, arriving with an anxiety disorder I had been quietly managing for years, was the first person to question that narrative. "What if," she said quietly, after I had apologized for the 10th time for complaining again, "sensitivity isn't the problem, but simply a response to what's been happening around you?" That question changed my world. Slowly, like a change of season, invisible from the inside, but irreversible. My parents were the kind of people typically described as complicated. They weren't monsters. They never hit me. They provided food, clothing, and education. But our home never had warmth, not the physical kind, but the kind you feel when you know you are accepted as you are. Instead, there was a permanent atmosphere of evaluation. My successes were received in silence. "Well, of course, that's how it's supposed to be." My failures received full attention. Analysis, dissection, comparison to other people's children who, at your age, had already. I grew up believing that love was something you had to earn. For my 30th birthday, I finally decided to celebrate the way I actually wanted. A small dinner at my apartment in Portland, the people closest to me, good wine, good food, no obligations. I invited my parents, even though I already felt something close to dread. They arrived with the expressions of people who had been brought to an obligation they hadn't planned for. My mother brought a gift wrapped in a bag from a store that clearly wasn't hers originally, and a flower that had visibly been sitting in water elsewhere before it arrived. My father held his phone and checked it every 5 minutes. The first half hour passed relatively peacefully, but then my mother asked to say a few words. She wanted to share something meaningful for the occasion. I nodded. She stood up, looked at me across the table, and began to speak about how I had always been a difficult child, how they had done everything they possibly could, and how, despite all my behavior, they continued to love me. She spoke for about 10 minutes. My guests, people who actually know me, who actually love me, sat in silence with expressions on their faces that I will never forget. Some stared at their plates. Some looked at me. My friend Catherine, sitting beside me, quietly placed her hand over mine. My mother finished. She smiled. She raised her glass. "To 30 years!" I don't remember exactly what I said after that. Something short and quiet. Something like, "Thank you for coming." That evening, after everyone had left, I sat in my kitchen and felt a strange emptiness. Not painful, but clean and simple, like a blank page. I sent my parents a short message the next morning. "I need some time to think about our relationship. I'll reach out when I'm ready." When I'm ready never came. I'm 34 now. I'm in therapy. I have real friends. And for the first time in my life, I don't apologize for taking up space in this world. It turns out I was never too sensitive. I was just finally safe.